Pretty diverse guy. Shovel or
And then, yeah, but I think that's yeah. So it's still doctor. We're okay. So to make a little tree. Ready to come up? No, I know.
Well, sure. Or all
Alright, thank you all so very much for joining us tonight. We're here in the workflow and online. This is right in Wyoming, and the Natural Resource Talk Club is so excited for this tonight. If you guys haven't done so already, please make sure to sign in. We are seeing a breakdown of the different people that are here tonight. This will be the second part of the two-part series. Don't worry if you weren't able to attend the field. There was student fronts today in this panel. The first part of this series was the Indigenous Hydrology and Acknowledgement Field Day. Participants were able to explore historical sites, learn about the impacts of groundwater extraction, and hunting them while honoring the deep-rooted connection with Indigenous people have with this land. Pictures from the event will be showcased at the end of the panel, and some of them are already playing above them. I'd like to thank everyone who took part in putting this field day together, and we would especially like to thank the local community for assisting and putting the event together on the field day. This panel tonight is diving further into the interconnection between groundwater and surface water. We are joined with Ann McKinnon, Reba Epler, Sandra Ironcloud, and Carolyn Lambert. As we gather here today, it is important to recognize and honor the land on which we meet. This place carries a deep history and a significance to the Indigenous people who have been its stewards for generations. We collectively acknowledge that the University of Wyoming occupies the ancestral and traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, and Shoshone Indigenous people, along with other Native tribes who call the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain regions home.
We recognize, support, and advocate alongside Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now and with those forcibly removed from their homelands. The Natural Resource Law Club and the law school greatly appreciates the interest and involvement of the tribal leaders and members of the Wind River Reservation. We deeply appreciate the opportunity to collaborate with the Wind River Reservation community in organizing both this evening's panel and the Indigenous Hydrology Land Acknowledgement Field Day. Your insights and engagement are invaluable to our efforts. Thank you for your partnership and in this important work. I'm going to turn the time over to Sandra Ironcloud, who's going to sing us a song before we get started with our panel tonight.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, rather. Nanana bete nani be. Nanana Chanupa Wakan Hukshila. And I want to thank you, Reba, and also for allowing us to be here to sing an opening song. We're going to sing a song that my husband composed for one of my students who served in the Marine Corps and who is currently retired. I've been teaching since 1985. And I've been teaching over 40 years. And the song we made, he gave it back to us. Although he made it, he said, I'm going to give it back to you so that you can sing this when you open a program or when you honor anyone. And it's a melody song. We don't have any vocables in it, no. So, you know, it's just a straight song that we sing for everyone today to give you encouragement and to start this program out in a good way. And I introduced ourselves in our language, but I'm Sandy Ironcloud. This is my husband, Pat Ironcloud, who is Ogallala Lakota, and I'm Northern Arapaho. So we're going to sing for you today. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that performance. Really quick, I'm going to introduce our panel moderator tonight, Ann McKinnon. Ann McKinnon has spent over 40 years in Wyoming with a distinguished journalism career that includes the Pulitzer Prize nomination. As former editor-in-chief of the Casper Star Tribune and co-founder of WyoFile.com, she brings a wealth of experience in translating natural resource management issues for general audiences. Ann holds a law degree and a PhD in natural resource economics and is focused on water management in arid regions. She has served on the Wyoming Water Development Commission, organized water conferences, and taught at the University of Wyoming, and is also the author of Public Waters, Lessons from Wyoming for the American West. We are very excited to have her with us this evening, and I'm going to be turning the time over to Anne to get us started with our panel tonight.
Thank you kindly. That's a very nice introduction. I'm here first to introduce our panelists. And we have Mrs. Sandra Ironclad, whom you've already heard from. She described how she has been a teacher for years at Wyoming Indian High School and the leader of the traditional club. She plays a very active role in her community and as an advocate for her people. She also leads the Little Sun Drum, who appeared at the field day. Carolyn Lambert is a hydrogeologist with over 20 years of experience. My computer is acting up. In groundwater flow and chemical transport, 3D geologic modeling, and 25 years of expertise in GIS. She works in regard to mining operations, water supply, environmental impact, and dewatering projects. She's also been an adjunct professor at the University of Northern Colorado in hydrogeology. And Reba Epler, who organized this panel, is a lawyer practicing in land and water law, now based in Eastern Laramie County, where she comes from a long-standing ranching family. We're going to start out with 10 minutes from each of the panelists. And we're not going to take a break because we have this wonderful reception with lots of food. So if you need to take a break, just stand up and go do so quietly. We're not going to take an official break. And then, sorry, it sounds like nobody can hear me, but that's okay. And then I'm going to do a little more background on the case and ask some questions of the panelists that I hope will lead to discussion, and then we're going to invite you to jump in. So we'll start with Reba, who can describe the issues in Eastern Laramie County that brought her to bring the lawsuit and what's happened with that.
Well, my name is Reba Adler, and can I close this in? Or not?
Oh, yes, please do.
I'm an attorney, but I grew up in southeastern Wyoming on a couple ranches. One in Tiding, which is south of here, and then one in eastern Laramie County in Hillsdale. And I went to law school in 2005 and graduated in 2009. And I've worked with a lot of ranchers and people throughout my practice in Wyoming, but mostly in southeastern Wyoming. And in 2019, a family applied for a large amount of groundwater applications, like 8 permits to my recollection. And they were asking for an insane amount of water. It was 4,600, almost 4,700 acre feet of water. And that, Carolyn pointed out last night, would be the amount of 1 acre of land, almost a mile high in water. So it's incredible. And that would be an annual use. And the request was to use that for groundwater. And they requested to use these water above the Horse Creek Valley. And the Horse Creek Valley is, Horse Creek flows into the North Platte. So it's Long Creek, and it starts just over the mountain in the Laramie Range. And it flows all the way past Meriden, and then flows north into the reservoir. And then it goes north out of there and eventually meets up with the North Platte River. And obviously the ranchers in the area were very concerned about this. So they came together and they opposed the applications. And this was through the state engineer's office. And then over the course of about 3 years, we finally got to have a contested case hearing. And that was held in the basement of the Capitol, which was very amazing to do it there. And the trial or the hearing lasted for 3 days. And in that time, we heard from their side and our side. And at the end of the day, there was nothing ruled on. And then the state engineer issued a proposed order granting all of these water rights to these people. And we regathered up and we put in a opposition to the proposed order, and basically going through all of the flaws that were laid out in their proposed order. And then nothing's happened. So since from the time of application through the contested case hearing, now those permits are just sitting with the state engineer's office in undecided form. And so they haven't ruled in favor of them or against them. But from our standpoint, from a ranching standpoint, from the people who use the water, and there are a number of ranchers in here, I'd like to mention Barb Crowell, Barb Kirkbride, who held Indigenous Hydrology Field Day on her ranch. Ryan Kirkbride, whose family is right below where these proposed wells were and would be dramatically affected by them. Augusta Settlers here, along with, and we were part of the lawsuit. And I'd also like to point out that we've got Wyoming Stock Growers and Albany County Conservation District here. So we've got a lot of people that are interested, and we've got people from the University of Wyoming College of Ag. And I don't know who's online, but there's a great deal of interest in this. And I just want to play, how much time do I have? This will take 2 minutes, but I really think this summarizes why we're so incredibly concerned about these groundwater permits being granted. How do I advance? I don't know that. Can you play that? Maybe not. Well, maybe not. Maybe we won't hear that. But the reason we're concerned is because the Ogallala Aquifer, it's called the High Plains Aquifer, is seriously stressed. It's been over appropriated, over pumped for many, many years. And the state of the aquifer is this is sort of out of date, and this was the 2015 map, but it just shows you the amount of depletion that this aquifer is under because of groundwater pumping. And my concern is that we don't want to have happen to Eastern Laramie County what's happened to New Mexico, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, especially. So we feel that it's right for the ranchers to protect their surface water. And do I just click? Yep. Okay. I think this is an important fact. Even though riparian and wetland areas only make up 4% of the state, they support over 80% of Wyoming's wildlife. Recent studies have estimated that between 15 and 21% of watersheds that experience groundwater pumping have slipped past a critical ecological threshold. And by 2050, that number could skyrocket to somewhere between 40 to 79%. So that's very alarming fact when you factor in groundwater pumping into the health of these creeks and rivers and ranches. This is a study that is 1994, and you can see that the upper is from 1961, and it just shows you that there's flowing streams, and they had gotten going with the center pivot, but they hadn't gotten going to the extent that they are going with it now. But that's in 1994, and you can see that almost all of the perennial streams are gone in western Kansas. And there's a picture right there of the Arkansas River that's dry and due to groundwater pumping. And this is a study that's peer reviewed, and then it's also reused in this Kansas Geological Survey presentation. So it's a recognized principle. This is from a book that my good friend Stan Leek did with a man named Barlow. And if you're tremendously interested in this, I have these studies, and it's called the it's called Stream Flow Depletion by Wells, Understanding and Managing the Effects of Groundwater Pumping on Stream Flow. So this is from his book, and it basically shows you that in the Oglala Aquifer, the High Plains, this is in Oklahoma, you have groundwater levels that continue to decline. And then that bar next below it shows that you have stream flow that declines and the base flow. And base flow is a really important concept because that's what keeps the stream flowing year round. If you lose your base flow, you lose your perennial flows, which is what most of the streams are east of here. Well, many places. Again, this is Lodgepole Creek, and I believe this was taken from a study that was done in Horse Creek. And it can show you that the amount of wells permitted steadily increases from 1934 up until you get to 1976, which is the creation of a control area. And then the flow in the creek declines. I can show you hundreds of graphs just like this. I mean, obviously we look at 1982 to 85, those were very wet years. And so there was just a lot of moisture, but after that it is dry. And this is a picture of 2021, but we saw the same thing at our field day as well, that the creek was dry. 1 minute. Okay, same. Okay, and I just want to show you Horse Creek, Wyoming, which is where the creek, this is the creek we're trying to protect. It's still flowing and it's in decent shape, but it is very, very endangered. There are springs that flow out of this. It's a very hydrated area that are is very, very endangered creek. And it is within a control area. And so that is an area that the state engineer has designated as at risk for overpumping, or it already has been overpumped. And we are basically talking about everything north of Highway 85, which is that road that goes diagonally there, and then it goes north up into Torrington. So that's where Horse Creek is that we're concerned with. And these are the reasons for establishing a control area. And in Laramie County, it was because of declining groundwater levels and possibility of conflict, which is where we're at now. And the concept that I think is really important to talk about that needs to be fleshed out in the law is that no appropriation shall be denied except when such denial is demanded by the public interest. And that's in the Wyoming Constitution. So, and also Wyoming groundwater law says the permit shall not be granted if the proposed use would be detrimental to the public interest. And we got the law changed with the burden of proof on the applicant, which was a great step in the right direction. And, you know, this is the public interest I want to talk about. And there will be other generations after ours. 26. Their lot in life will depend largely on the inheritance we leave them. We all must be bridge builders, not only for the present generation, but for generations yet unborn. So I think that this is where I'd like to stop, because the question is, how do we move forward? And I'd like to point you to this principle of rejuvenation. And this is from a man named Rajinder Singh. So this is where I'd like to go with water law in the future. Thank you.
Can you come next? You have any comments you want to make? You know, I think, yeah, okay.
I want to thank Reba for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I met her in July in Cheyenne. I take care of our little son drum and dance group, and we do the dance presentations in Cheyenne. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm a longtime educator. I've been teaching since 1985. And I brought our traditional club down to visit the ranch. And I want to thank the family there, the Bride family, for being very hospitable to us, and also for, I believe it was the College of Law students who provided the lunch. Well, and also we had St. Stephen's Indian School there who cooked for us that evening. And for my students and myself, in looking at the issue of with the groundwater, you know, we're from the Wind River Indian Reservation. Much of our water sources comes from the mountains and also from groundwater sources in the Lander and Riverton area. And water is always an issue among our people. There's one going on right now, but I'm not going to get into that because I think the important thing is to remember what the ranchers are facing in the southwest and the southeast area. And for my students to meet with the ranchers and to listen to the guest speakers, you know, and looking at how their livelihood, their way of life is being infringed upon, you know, by in danger of losing those resources because water is life. Water is life, whether it comes from the mountains, whether it comes from the ground stream, you know, from the ground springs and so forth. And, you know, it was really good to visit and look at it from that aspect because one of the things my students shared with one of the speakers was, you know, we know what it's like to have things taken away from us, our language, our culture, our way of life, but you know what, we are still here. And with my students going there, they shared their sentiments as well, because you know what, you are still here, ranchers. Your homes are still there. And in a way of public interest, everyone needs to be aware of these issues that impact all of our communities. Not only the ranches, but the surrounding communities. Because when that water, when those aquifers are gone, because it's endangered right now. You know, when all the, you know, granted we have population growth and so forth and housing developments coming up that are taking those groundwater sources. When that is gone, there's no bringing it back. And that's the, I don't even want to fathom that because, you know, it's going to change a whole way of life for Wyoming in general, because where I come from, we have a lot of ranchers. You know, some of my relatives are ranchers. And, you know, they rely on that, on the water. They rely on the water not only for their crops, for whatever, you know, their animals. And, you know, there was so many things that we became aware of. Many of my students never ever thought of it as an issue. And for them to come and to be aware of how it impacts our communities, how it impacts our state, how it impacts our home, and what would happen if we lose our water. And, you know, it was a very meaningful learning experience because we were even able to look at some of the home sites of the cabin that was still there, which was from the late 1800s. And to have just to look at the reality of those people who came to settle, who came to farm the land, who came to use the water. And, you know, many of the families, one of the things, you know, that was real, what my students learned was just looking at issues that impact all of our people, regardless of what color your skin is, regardless of what nationality you are, regardless if you're Northern Arapaho or Oglala Lakota or Eastern Band Shoshone. Water is important to all of us because water is life. I hope we'll do that.
And Carolyn.
Thank you. So, get used to talking to the microphone. Thank you for the introduction, Anne. I won't go too much into my background since she already introduced me, but I'm a hydrogeologist. I have a master's degree from the University of Arizona. And since then, I've been doing mostly consulting work in primarily groundwater modeling. That's kind of my expertise. in water supply, and currently I'm working for SRK Consulting out of Denver, working in mostly mining. Although I have a professional registration here in Wyoming. There it goes. So I have 10 minutes to give you a crash course in hydrogeology. I understand from your professor that you have had a little bit of water, groundwater understanding, but the main idea that I want to get across is this, the groundwater balance. That's what we start off with in my class. Every semester, right away, we learn the groundwater balance, and that's what I do with my groundwater models also. We want to keep this aquifer as balanced as possible. So in the natural system, in equals out. Plus or minus some storage change. So you have you're into your system, you have precipitation, recharge, return flow, which is, after you pumped the aquifer, maybe you apply it to the land and some of that recharges back into the aquifer. So that's return flow. You also have inflow from other aquifers through the groundwater system. You have continuing drainage from the shallow system into your aquifer. And then you have evapotranspiration. So evaporation and whatever the trees and plants are using through transpiration. Then you also have the stream bed interaction. So in and out from stream beds. And that's kind of the focus of what we want to look at in this panel today. So how does that really work? So in the natural system, in a case like this stream body that we have here, water flows toward the stream and it feeds the stream system and causes that base flow that Reba was talking about. And this is called an unconfined aquifer, so it's just flowing toward the stream. Well, if you put in a well and you pump that system, you change kind of the natural dynamic of the system a little bit. So you're changing the gradient from flowing toward the river to possibly reversing that and having it flow maybe not as much toward the river, or maybe even having the river feed your well. So you could really change the whole system there if you're pumping for long enough. And a lot of that depends on how close you are to the stream, how long you're pumping, how much you're pumping, and the kind of the system that you're talking about. What are the properties of your aquifer? Is it sands and gravels? Is it bedrock? All of that comes into play for how you're going to impact your stream. I won't get too much into the numerical side of groundwater modeling, but this is what I do. This is kind of how I spend my days worrying about aquifer properties. We call it hydraulic conductivity, is how fast your water moves through the system. And flow in and out with how much, how you can predict impacts of whatever you're trying to predict. In my case, it's often a mine. But in this case that we're going to be talking about here, it's how these wells that are proposed could impact a stream. So we actually took this model that was already created by a company called AMEC in 2014. This was designed to help the Laramie County commissioners make decisions about their groundwater. And so I got access to this model and was able to simulate what could happen if these 8 production wells were drilled and pumped for 40 years, because that was the length of their model simulation. So if we pumped for 40 years, what could happen? I won't get too much into the details of the model because I think I have maybe 4 minutes left. But we have in this area, we have 4 major formations. We have the Ogallala, the Arickaree, I guess that's fine. The White River, the Lance and the Fox Hills. The Ogallala and the Arickaree are kind of together in the High Plains Aquifer. Most of the pumping comes from the Ogallala and the Arickaree formations because the White River has very low permeability, and you have to go a long way to get to the Lansing Fox Hills typically. So as Reba said, these 8 proposed wells the total pumping would be 4,642 acre feet per year, which is a lot of water. That, just to give you a perspective, it's kind of hard to know what the actual recharge is to a basin. There are a lot of different estimates out there, but one of the estimates that I saw for Upper Lodgepole Creek was 11,000 acre feet per year for the whole basin. So this is quite a big proportion of that. So it's not sustainable, right? You can't keep that pumping going and still be feeding it with recharge. So where does it come from? Well, this is, it's called a potentiometric surface. It's just the groundwater level in an unconfined aquifer. And this naturally flows in the direction you see with those arrows across the valley into and creates these springs and streams just through the natural topography of the area. So what we did is we added these wells to the model to simulate how much the groundwater level would decline because this water is not being replaced through natural recharge. So we ran the model for 40 years, and we found that, locally it could decline 40, 50 or more feet, but that propagates toward the springs and creeks. And so eventually, and it's not a matter of really if, but when, it will impact these creeks. So our prediction was that after 40 years, you would have 2 to 5 feet of groundwater decline, which can really make a big difference in your base flow. And of course, these creeks and springs then feed Horse Creek and further downstream implications. I don't think I have to begin with details.
You've got about 2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay.
Because you're preceding people generously.
All right, thank you. So just a quick example of how this order so in 2014, there was an order through the state engineers that determined about how much decline you can have in your groundwater system through these pumping these wells. And so it's all about the saturated thickness of the aquifer. So you have to know how much saturated thickness you have and how much you can change that during your pumping simulation. So I appreciate that they're using the science, they're using these tools that they have to try to figure out how to make the laws. And now it's just a matter of applying that and making sure that everybody understands how that works, because it's really a complicated system to try to apply the science to the law and vice versa.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to give you all a little additional background. Reba designed this panel, and as you can tell, it mostly describes her case. And I think you might need to know a little additional background. So I think you all, certainly you all who are law students and others probably are aware that the idea of the prior appropriation law for water law, which is what we have in this state and which most Western states have, is that it's very important to get water into the hands of individual people who will put it to use, and that will be a benefit to the society, particularly in 1890 when our laws were written. That was considered extremely important. And some of the experience with prior appropriation and the genesis of prior appropriations in California, because it was settled earlier. And there were commentators there who pointed out, you know, with this law, people can dry up the stream. Now, I think you all know that prior appropriation allows you to dry up a stream. That's why we had a big fight over creating an in-stream flow law to try to figure out a legal mechanism to protect water flowing in the stream. So really, the groundwater the groundwater law came around later because the big kind of major groundwater building really happened after World War II. But there's the same, for areas that are not in a control area where there's not concern about excessive drawdown of the groundwater, the statute actually says that permits to drill will be granted as a matter of course, with consideration of, is there any available water? Is it an appropriate well? And is it not detrimental to interest? And I'm going to try to direct this discussion. So just as Rita said, it really should be all about the public interest. What does that mean? That's what her case is really about. The public interest question is, I mean, the consideration of public interest is in our Constitution, specifically about water, and in many of the statutes. Now, the creation of a control area is an interesting thing that has to do with the state engineer's office, who has a whole groundwater section with people who are very well versed in groundwater issues, that there either has occurred a lot of drawdown, seems to be likely it could occur. As I think Carolyn has demonstrated, it's not all that easy to figure out exactly what's happening when the groundwater resource is given that we can't see them as easily as we can see reservoirs and rivers. So in the situation of a control area, it's no longer that it is granted as a matter of course if water is available and it's not, and the well is adequate. And that it's not detrimental to the public interest. The state engineer has to get the advice of the control area advisory board. And in this case, that's what happened. The control area advisory board recommended, after hearing some of the Reba's clients and others in the area, recommended that permits not be granted because they said water was not available. The case then went to a hearing officer who is a member of the groundwater division of the state engineer's office. And he ended up finding that it was not possible to say that water was not available. Again, you have to think about the background of Wyoming prior appropriation law and prior appropriation law in general. We want to get this stuff into use. That's the sort of background idea. Comes from the 19th century, but it's still there. So he found, he went through Carolyn's present data and her runs on that, on what's called the ANEC model. And he ruled that because she ran it for full bore, those wells producing at their maximum amount for 40 years, he called that an unrealistic situation because the limits in the control area and this part of the control area would kick in, and there could be conditions on the permit so that wouldn't happen. He also, I always have to remember this because I'm not a hydrologist. He said some of the figures didn't match the calibration of the model, and that it didn't use proportionality. It was sort of numbers instead of percentages of what would happen. And that even in the worst case she describes, that water still would be available. And he went into a public interest analysis, which I'll bring up in a minute. So one of the things also about Wyoming water law is it has changed. Our society has changed a good deal since the 1890s. And water law has changed with it. Slowly, thoughtfully, caution, but it has changed. And so one of the, places where that's been possible has been in the definition of beneficial use. The beneficial use in the statutes is the basis, the measure, and the limit of a waterway. But what is a beneficial use? It is not defined in the statutes. And that has proved to be a good thing because state engineers over the years have added to the list of possible things that will be considered a beneficial use. And it is not just irrigation, industrial, and municipal. It includes aesthetic in some cases, like particularly in Teton County where people have the money to worry about aesthetic uses of water. So that fact that it's not defined has one of the ways that Wyoming water law has been able to adapt to a changing society. And where I'd like to direct this discussion, and Reba led into it, is so what is the public interest? That also is not defined anywhere in the water statute. Now, the hearing officer for the state engineer's office, and as I said, he ended up recommending that the permits be granted, and this is what Reba mentioned, but nothing has happened since then, and the state engineer hasn't acted on it. So those permit applications are pending, but there's been no decision. And he went through a public interest analysis and was trying to figure out, so is the public interest everything we can think of that affects us all in this basin or even beyond? Or there was one case, the state engineer's office, from my point of view, I spent a lot of time reading the archives, has been really careful not to rule on the basis of public interest, if they can help it. So that's why you don't find a lot of definitions. But there was a case in 1915 where the dam that was proposed to be built on the Boise side of the Wind River Canyon was proposed to be, I think, 60 feet high. And the state engineer said, well, you know, this is actually a good place for a railroad, and that the Bighorn Basin needs this connection to the rest of the state. It's very hard to get there otherwise. So we're going to cut that dam down to 33 feet, something like that. Now, he was able to think about that because the Chicago and Burlington, the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad showed up in front of him and said, we don't like this 60-foot dam proposal. So it wasn't that it was like just sort of out there somewhere. But what and I would say that Reba, who's done that in this case, showed up and said, these things are an issue. What the hearing examiner decided was that you probably had to think, well, it's got to be things within the state engineer's realm of expertise. And he can figure out that if you have a 60-foot dam, what that will do to a possible railroad right away. That is within his engineering head to be able to figure out. But in this case, the hearing examiner said, but you know, the projections say things could happen. We don't know for sure when and if they will, particularly if conditions are put on the permit. These are not things the state engineer has expertise in, whether the effect on soils or riparian areas, or there was a suggestion of a threatened species that was found in the area. He doesn't have that expertise. That was basically the hearing officer's conclusion. And so he couldn't reach a decision that was detrimental to the public interest. But what I think Reba's case raises, and in different ways you all have spoken to this, is, well, okay, it's the 21st century. How are we going to think about the public interest in relation to water decisions? And so that's what I would like to ask you panelists. Is what the hearing officer described was, let's look at the state engineer's expertise and things he could reasonably, with his expertise, foresee and believe are going to happen. is that a decent standard or should it be something else? And how do we arm the state engineer's office to make these decisions? If they need, if there's always been a he, but maybe there'll be a she for the if the state engineer is faced with a decision, what kinds of expertise and how can it be provided? And I wondered if you each could comment on that. I don't care who speaks first. Use your mics right there so you don't have to keep coming up and down.
Sure. Well, so there is no definition of public interest in Wyoming, but water has to be used beneficially, and that means that when you apply water to irrigate, it has to be a quantity that's reasonable to bring that crop to its full completion. And in this case, they applied for almost 4,700 acre feet of water, but through an analysis using the United States government's agricultural soils maps, we determined that that wasn't even half as much of water as it would be required to irrigate that many acres. So really, they were going to use this water to irrigate crops on lands that are classified by the United States government for the U.S. Oh gosh, there's a soils part of the government.
The NRCS.
NRCS as unsuitable for cultivation, meaning that it should never have been plowed in the first place. So if you were to apply water to that 4,600 acre feet, that many acres, one, you wouldn't even get a crop to finish out. So why were they applying for that water? Well, there was a lot of oil activity in the area, and they had another pivot they were selling water to, the oil company, and they were making about $1 million a year. And they said, simple math, one pivot good, 8-9 pivots great, that's $9 million a year. So they wanted to use that water ultimately to frack, to sell to frack. So we presented that this water should not have ever been granted because the use is not beneficial. So the state engineer should take that into consideration, because if the water cannot be used beneficially, then it should not be granted, and that is within our constitution and our statutes. So that's calculation number one that I think the state engineer is failing to adequately analyze in their proposed order.
And I have a wonderful quote from the hearing officer on that subject about the finding of, about the information on suboptimal soil, in which he says, but if this fact alone was sufficient to support a finding of speculation, applying for a water right because you're really going to mess around with it in some other way and it's not beneficial. Many of the water rights which have been granted over the course of history in Wyoming, and indeed in much of the arid states, would not exist, because we all know people have tried to irrigate all kinds of soil. But anyway, yeah.
Okay, I want to speak to that point.
Okay.
Because in I don't remember the year, there was a man named Jim Pike who proceeded to recognize that the groundwater was over appropriated. And he started a program through the NRCS and, yes, I believe it was NRCS, called AWEP. AWEP said to farmers who are operating in suboptimal situations, we'll pay you to abandon your water right. So the state engineer was very supportive of this. His name was Pat Terrell, and he recently died. And he was super supportive of the retirement of groundwater rights. And he promised Jim Pike that he would not undo the gains that were made through AWEP. So through AWEP, 1 billion gallons of water a year were retired. Now, it doesn't make any sense to use federal government money to retire wells and then issue new permits in worse soils than the ones the people were already retiring. So it would not be in the public interest to grant those in light of the waste of federal dollars through AWEP.
Now, that was in a different part of the county or not?
Same part.
A1?
Yeah.
Wasn't it more around Pine Bluff?
Well, my family participated in it. Hillsdale got rid of 2 wells through it.
Yeah. Carolyn, do you have some thoughts on how this could work to include the kinds of issues you all have been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, from what I saw, the state engineer here it seemed kind of, a reactionary, the way that they apply the rules about groundwater withdrawals, where they say, okay, you can drill this well here, you have a monitoring well here, and we'll see what happens, rather than predicting what could happen using the tools that they have. And I think, you know, I didn't get into their tool necessarily, the AMAC model and its limitations, but I saw some limitations of this model. Of course, no model is going to give you the right answer, but they can be useful and they can give you some idea of how much you can withdraw and what kind of impacts you can use. And then run a sensitivity analysis and see, okay, well, maybe it'll be this much drawdown, maybe it'll be less, maybe it'll be more, based on changing the parameters of the aquifer in the model. But the idea is to be able to use these tools that they currently have and make these predictions and design the law around these predictions, which they're doing in Arizona and Nevada and other arid states.
And when you say design the law, would that mean permit conditions or really
Yeah,
changes in the law?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Be able to say, you know, in Arizona, for example, they, you know, this is based on new developments, but you can't build a new development unless you can prove
Residential
year.
Right.
I'm sorry, yes, housing development. Unless you can prove that you have 100-year water supply.
Mhm.
And that's through use of predictive tools.
Mhm.
So to be able to do something forward thinking like that, I think is important.
And Reba mentioned, because of the publicity, which you were very good at generating about this case, she was able to get a change in the law which shifted the burden of proof when you're in a permit that's being contested in a control area of an application. So that it's the person applying who has the burden of proof of showing that there is water available and that it's not detrimental to the public interest, I believe it is. So just to mention that, because that sort of fits with what you're saying.
Absolutely. I mean, I work for mining companies and we have to prove that they are not going to impact water quality, water quantity, you know, that there's going to be, that everything's going to be done responsibly from the water perspective.
Now, of course, the change in the statute won't affect these exact applications because they preceded the change, right? It's not retroactive. But, okay, and Sandra, what are your thoughts on this about, you know, I luckily tribal water law, I know a little bit about the water code on the river and it's quite different. It has different premises than the state water law, but still, I think you can contribute a good deal to how this should be thought about and managed in the state water law.
Wow, this is all I have to, you know, the issues presented here with Reva's case and with the information that you shared here. Was, you know, looking at public interest is it's very integral to make sure that these issues are brought publicly, because it not only impacts, you know, the communities of Berry, of Cheyenne, that whole area there, Pine Bluffs, you know, all of the farming communities along there, Torrington. And, you know, I think it's very important to remember the basis, the foundation of why this court case came about in addressing groundwater issues. And it's, you know, for me, I live, you know, northwest of here. But, you know, water, and I'm going to reiterate, water is life. Whether it's from our mountains, whether it's from the groundwater, because it sustains not only us, but our generations that are going to follow us. Because if we use all of this water, if we let companies overdevelop this water, what are we going to have for our children? What are we going to have for our grandchildren and their children? we have to think about those generations that are going to follow us. You know, what resources are they going to have for their way of life, whether it's being a rancher, whether it's being working in the oil fields, whether it's working with companies, you know, that use the water. And, you know, for me, this point in my mind is use the water responsibly. Not only for our people, for the ranchers, but for everyone. Look at what, you know, other states have in place that are using it responsibly. And, you know, for me, just listen randomly here with what's presented here, our lawmakers, our legislators need to be educated on what the water issues are, or what impacts the communities of Wyoming, what impacts the ground roots people in these communities. They need to be educated. And, you know, to every issue besides groundwater as well, you know, but that's just my perspective as a teacher, as a grandmother.
Thank you. You know, speaking about educating legislators, I wonder, Reba, how much would you like to see, detailed or not, some kind of definition in the statutes of the public interest related to water?
Well, I think it's really going to be a fight over what is defined as the public interest. So Alaska had done that. I believe Frank Trelease went to Alaska and defined what is the public interest. And that's a good definition, but I really don't think that it includes indigenous perspectives at all, which are very valuable. And we're learning how to work with indigenous people. And I also think that the recognition of climate change is got to be in water law. The water cycle is a big driving factor in climate change. And if you dehydrate all this land, it's called aridification, it's happening all over the West, you are going to drive climate change. So I wanted to show a presentation about how when the land gets hot, it cannot rain. And we are in the midst of an incredible drought. I have never seen anything like this. And it's also coinciding with drying up of a massive amount of groundwater fed springs and streams and wetlands. So I really think that the law has to recognize that the water cycle is part of the cooling cycle of the planet and it has to be protected. And I really think that even if you have an existing water right, that is going to have to be something taken into consideration. There is a precedent for that. That would be in the Horse Creek Valley, where people who have existing groundwater rights to irrigate with pivot were reduced and restricted in the amount that they could use. And that was due to a fight that happened between Nebraska and Wyoming. But still, it reduced the amount of water that they could apply. And I think, honestly, if you can't grow a crop in southeastern Wyoming with 14 inches of rain plus what nature gives you, then we really need to reconsider those crops because they're taking too much water.
And I guess part of my question though, and then I want to move on to a related question is, so should that be in the law statutory written, or should it be something the state engineer's office adopts? Because since there isn't a statutory definition of public interest, just like there isn't a beneficial use, they could go places with it. So, you know, and the legislature, I've personally always opposed the idea of the legislature laying out beneficial uses, because then it's like, oh, all the things got left out. Because, well, we all have our different opinions about the legislature, but sometimes it's scary to take them an issue. Anyway, what do you think about that? Do you really want it to be laid out?
No, I don't. I think it's too dangerous to lay out what the public interest is in the statute. I really think that it should be something. You asked the question about why can't the state engineer consider these things? Well, what if we made it so that the state engineer wasn't just an engineer, but also a hydrologist, a hydrogeologist, an ecologist, a geologist, a biologist, agronomist. I mean, what if we expanded who could become the state engineer so that they could be able to consider these things? I mean, that, especially including a hydrologist, at least we should make it so that an engineer or a hydrologist could be state engineer.
And that would be a constitutional change, I believe.
Okay.
But that's, yeah, I mean, so you weren't proposing somebody be all five of those things.
No, they
One
can't.
is, yeah, good.
Often hydrologists are engineers, that's the background, and I've heard of. I don't know if it was in Arizona where there was a hydrologist who was also an engineer, became the state engineer. So it does happen, but it's, yeah, I think that it's important if you can't have that person in charge, be a hydrologist, have access to hydrologists, and access to the ecologists, and be willing to have a whole suite of scientists that are advising you.
How about contracting with the Department of Environmental Quality to supply some of that? I don't know the suite of what expertise they have, but anyway.
Yeah, send the fish and wildlife service or the
Yeah.
state game fish.
Yeah. Another thing I'm about to turn this over to you guys, that this makes me think about is, how these interconnections between groundwater and surface water and the ecological health that your case points out, how that could impact other areas of waterlogged. At the moment, if you change from flood irrigation from a ditch to pivot, it's not considered a change of use, meaning there is not an analysis of how much you consumed before and making sure that the change you make is not going to affect the return flow, which goes into the groundwater and affects your neighbors and the water table and the stream flow. In other states, they do. Typically, I think that's been under population pressure. But in this state, that still hasn't happened. So I wondered what you guys think about just, changes in the way people do use water, how that should be looked at.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I don't know the intricacies of Wyoming law in this perspective, but in Colorado, we have a tributary definition to groundwater. So, groundwater feeds a stream, typically in arid climates. And so if you're pumping near the stream, you're actually pumping what could be surface water. So having a definition of what that distance is, I think is really, it's complicated, but I think it's important to be able to know you can't just put a well next to a stream and call it strictly groundwater. It will be surface water. It should be surface water. So to be able to have that definition in the law, I think it's important.
And that has happened on the North Platte and all its tributaries, I believe, with the North Platte, I forget what it's called, but the governing body now that works about that. And I should have mentioned that in this case, the hearing officer pointed out that, yeah, these wells, they're big and they're closely spaced, but they are just within the spacing allowed by the original control area order. So I think it's time. I feel like I may be putting people to sleep. So I hope you guys have questions in both what did you mean by X and what did that number mean? And also, what about all these questions we've been raising? Becky?
Hi. This question is to Reba. You said that you thought that enshrining in statute what public interest means would be dangerous. Could you speak some more about that and what the dangers you perceive it to be?
Well, there's gonna be a big fight over how that's defined. I would love to just define it as we preserve all the remaining creeks and also change the water law to restore creeks back to their flow. But I don't think that that's gonna be what the true definition of public interest is. So there's gonna be, what is public interest? It's everything. It's like, Well, Sinclair Oil just got a change of use and they can take water from a ranch. That's in the, they're saying that's in the public interest, even though that might affect, ranchers. It's such a broad thing, but what I think it means is that in every case, you really do a full analysis of the impacts. And who does that water impact? And presently in the state analysis, they do no analysis of what will be the impact of that appropriation. And we ought to require the applicant to do an analysis, a hydrological analysis to start with, to show what the impact is, and then allow people to review that and determine, is that gonna affect me, my ranch, my windmills, my things that are already using water? Or does it affect the climate? I mean, it's an enormous analysis, but it needs to be done.
So in the absence of being in statute, who would you want that analysis to be done by?
Well, it's done right now by both parties presenting their interests and how they're gonna be impacted. There's a part of that that's legitimate, that both sides should say, this is how this is gonna affect me. But the ultimate decider is the state engineer as to whether that anybody opposing these is gonna be affected so much that it's detrimental to the public interest.
Thank you.
Mhm.
A few more questions. Oh, well, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so this is to whoever, when a permit like the one here is under consideration, is there any requirement that the SEO like notify people that might be impacted by it? Maybe on like a watershed scale?
I think so because of the control area.
In control areas, they have to publish these notices of these applications. That's one change I think needs to be made in state law in general, is that anything greater than 25 gallons a minute should be published everywhere. So anybody, because I really think that this is the control area law of Laramie County, Goshen County, and Niobrara County. It should just be statewide. We really are so arid that I think that we should make it that. But otherwise, they don't publish those notices unless you're in control area.
So the surface water applications also?
I suppose.
Yeah, I think you can, if you know what you're doing, you can go find what's been posted as the way of permit applications, but that's not the same as.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask next, was where you look, if you're not in control area.
Yeah,
Yeah, in the local newspaper, they have to publish it in either the Tribune or the Pine Bluff Post, and whoever does the paper in Wheatland or Lusk.
but that's in the control area, and you're not in the control area. I think you have to. I've argued for this before, guys, you gotta make this more publicly available, and I can't remember whether you go to the surface water division and find all the applications, same with groundwater. Can't remember whether that's true.
Seems there's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, but Reba, it was very interesting how the people from LaGrange and Hawk Springs at just downstream from Horse Creek did not know about goings on and how that would really impact that if those wells were appropriate.
So what Ryan pointed out is that the notices were put in the paper in Laramie County, but not in Goshen County. So we had to do a tremendous amount of legwork to notify the people in Goshen County, and obviously they were quite concerned because it would destroy the flows in Horse Creek, and these people have all these surface water rights. But it was only because we did the work to notify them. Sorry, what did you say, Carol? Sorry.
I know that there are currently communities in California, these small rural communities that are currently totally dried up, and the municipalities have to ship in water. Meanwhile, down the road, there's alfalfa being grown. Do you believe that there are some municipalities in Wyoming that are at risk of drying up completely like that?
Well, yes, Sandra can speak to that. Pavilion, that would be a community that was affected by water contamination.
It's different, though it wasn't a loss of.
No, it was contamination.
Yeah.
But yes, all the little towns in Wyoming have small municipal wells, and there are applications right now that have been heard that I believe would dry up Carpenter. Carpenter had to get a municipal well because their septic tanks were contaminating their house wells, so they went to become a little municipal district. And these new applications are for a dairy, and you've got huge contamination associated with that. And then you've got the, like, taking away the water from that little community. So I think that would dry up Carpenter's wells. Yes, I believe that Alvin, Pine Bluffs, Carpenter, Burns, these are just little towns in Wyoming, are very at risk for losing their groundwater. And I think it will probably be statewide. I mean, we certainly read about Rollins being that differently because they have wooden pipes, but all the towns in Wyoming's water infrastructure is not up to par. Would that be true on the reservation standards?
Currently with, Michael, and talking with, Ryan Williams, we talk a lot about with, our water issues and so forth. But I believe we do also need to work on our pipelines, especially with our older houses that we have, our housing developments, and, for us, it's, I want to reiterate on it, but, I kind of, we are, looking at different issues that impact our community, especially with the Midvale irrigation district. And the water that is being diverted to there, other than coming down to our communities and so forth. But that's a whole other situation, but yes, I believe our communities are in danger of losing the groundwater sources, based on how it's being used, based on how it's being piped to other communities and so forth.
When Reba mentions the communities in eastern Laramie County, I believe the AWEB program was partially aimed at making it possible for those communities to keep on going. And I think it's worth mentioning that the Wyoming Water Development Commission puts a lot of money into groundwater and other systems for small towns. So it's, California it's taken California a long time to recognize that groundwater and surface water actually might have a connection. I think Wyoming has done a little better.
If I can just add one more thing to the groundwater supply issues. In a lot of communities, it's not whether you dry up the aquifer, it's whether it's feasible for some of these smaller domestic wells or stock wells to reach the water anymore. So they drilled it under one condition, and then as the groundwater declines, maybe they would need to re-drill a deeper well, or maybe even in a deeper aquifer that's now just financially not realistic for them.
You say what it costs. Well, it would cost more.
Yeah, for sure. It costs more to pump, it costs more to drill. It's just an expensive endeavor.
But that's where state money, which is from coal and oil taxes for the Water Development Commission, a lot of it goes to those small towns. I think we need to recognize that Wyoming has done some things about some of that. So yeah.
So me and my grandpa Casey Eckler do farming and ranching. So in Wyoming, cold, bitter, dry winters are hard on the cattle, and you are going to need to irrigate with your alfalfa or such to feed your cattle so people can eat. Now our neighbors Talkingtons, they do silage and corn and all that. It uses about 100,000 gallons of water per 1 million gallons per day, and they're irrigating all the time. Now if you did that in California, you dry up a lot. The people there need the water. So in conclusion, it's harder. So yes, they are shipping down water there, but they could it's also responsible for some of the irrigating too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think water in general has been a really bad PR problem. I don't think people care about it. I think people, I feel like the guy sitting on the side of the street with the end of the world sign. And I can only shout so much. But I guess my question is for the whole panel, what do we do to get people to care about it?
With our community, we have a really strong advocate, Wes Markel, who brings up our issues with our water and how it's going to impact our communities downstream with, Vicki, with Fort Washakie, with Arapahoe, especially because we have a lot of ranchers in Arapahoe, who both native and non-native. And, and how that water being diverted to other areas, such as the Alpha Irrigation District, how it's going to impact, our communities as such. And so, getting people to notice, I believe, is public knowledge, getting it out there, talking with people, visiting schools. What he did is he came to our summer school program. Water is life was one of our themes for our summer school program. Because we look at it at many different, from many different aspects, especially what happened in North Dakota with the pipeline. It was not a protest, it was to protect the water. And I was an advocate for that as well, because my sons went up there. They went up there to sing, they went up there to stand with the people, and even the ranchers at that time, because there were non-native ranchers who stood with the native people and protected the water source. And that became a slogan across Indian country, and not just Indian country, but across many communities, that water is life. And it's just making people aware, like what we're having here right now. What's going on right here, right now, and supporting one another. And getting it out there with universities, with colleges, with public community meetings, with town meetings. Getting the word out there. Networking with different organizations and stressing how important groundwater resources are, regular resources from the mountains and from streams, and looking at, what is going on with the aquifers, looking at what different areas, you have a whole state, you have the whole maps of where all the different aquifers are, and those communities that are within that area. Because for us being able to go and visit these communities, come visit the ranchers, it sparked an interest in my students. To where when we went back, we spoke with one of our elders, who's also a grandparent within our school. And she was very knowledgeable on this area because she comes from a rancher family. She grew up in Cromer. And she was able to share with them the importance of understanding of how these aquifers how they support each community. But public knowledge, getting it out there, networking, sharing, getting people to, because it impacts communities, it impacts states, and one of the comments he made is that our water is going to California, and so it's, there's just so many different aspects you can look at it, from, and just, yeah.
Albany County, in the past few years, the city and the county have worked to create an aquifer protection plan here. Because the aquifer sort of, I'm not a good describer of it, but coming down the hill from, is what Laramie depends upon. So, keeping up with that, I think there's some local water protection groups, that's one, finding out about them, and then larger groups around the state. The people have also said, well, what if you put more of a price on water? And the guy who wrote Wyoming water law in 1890 said, well, I think we're going to get to the point where people will realize they're renting water from the state. It's not happening. And the Bureau of Reclamation has been criticized for not charging people enough for water. But still, all across the West and in the Colorado River Basin, which is seeing a lot of aridification, 80% of the water is, or more than 80, is used for ag. So it's not like it's all people, people are eating the ag products, although some of those products are exported. Anyway, there's a lot to get involved with if you want to.
How about some of the online?
So one of the questions is related to Cody's question about defining public interest statutorily. I think this is for Viva, do you feel that the existing priorities for water use in Wyoming statutes are sufficient, or do they need to be modified?
You mean, oh, okay, I think what he mean, Cody at Mannerman.
This is from an anonymous attendee.
Okay, an anonymous person. There are priorities in use, and so basically in Wyoming, the highest priority is for man or beast. They should not deny water to drink for human consumption or household use or to water livestock, because that's really what the state was founded on. And then I think they go on in priority, like above agriculture, they consider industrial use or something like that. So there are lists of priorities. And I guess among priorities, they should include health of the stream as well.
They often do, sorry, there are in-stream flow rights, right? I mean, there's a certain amount of water often that you have to keep in the stream it's limited, it's tricky to get into flow right away. Okay, it's owned by the state. There are all kinds of restrictions, but there are, yeah.
I think there's another clarifying question. I believe one of you mentioned fracking earlier, or what it means to frack. If someone could expand on that briefly.
This is not my area of expertise. I'm not an oil and gas person, but the idea is that you use fluids to pressurize the system in the underground. So you're basically injecting water and other substances into the aquifer, or not into the aquifer, into the formation to break it up a little bit and make it so that your wells can be more productive, because it's usually in like a tight bedrock. And so if they break it up a little bit, then you can have access to more of that oil that's in there.
But they do use groundwater to frack, which is quite concerning to me. You could take the freshest, purest water on the face of the planet. And Jim Pike has said this, he said, I lived in Vietnam where you cannot drink the water. And in Wyoming, we're gonna take the freshest and purest water you've ever had and pump it down a hole to frack a well. That is very concerning to me. I know that there's a lot of economic benefit to that, but there's also huge amount of consequences for using the fresh water to do that.
Well, and they mix it with other things that are not so fresh in order to get it to be more productive.
Given the political reality of the state, what are some actual things, like some practical things that we can do, or anybody can do in terms of advocacy for protecting this resource?
Well, you are here, you're learning, and that's wonderful. So your participation is noted in the amount of people that came to this panel. One of the things you can do that we've had great success with is, I had a YouTube talk that's probably had almost 17 views now, which by YouTube standards is not great, but from a water perspective, I think is pretty high. And if you want to write to the governor, you should write to the governor, all of you, and say, Mr. Governor, we heard this talk, and we heard how these ranchers are going to be affected by groundwater pumping. We highly encourage you, one, to not grant these permits that are before the state engineer, or encourage you not to do that, but also work with the people in those communities to develop a better plan to deal with that resource. So I highly encourage you to do that. Reach out to the governor's office. It's not hard.
Anybody else online? That's all, sure. Okay, I was just gonna say in the kitchen. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'm not preempting somebody online.
Oh, no. Look at it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, from the science point of view, and I was part of the team that did the AMIC model that you talked about. it's frustrating when we hear this, we're gonna science our way out of it. And all this whole discussion is political. This gentleman talks about protecting the resource. What do you mean by protecting? If we mean we're never gonna use another drop of water, that would be one standard, but I would just emphasize that we could have all the science in the world and understand where every drop goes. And these aren't science questions fundamentally, they're political questions. Is a wetland that supports a group of salamanders worth more to us than a second cutting that allows the farmer to buy shoes for the kids for Christmas? So there's no easy answer here. It really does come down to politics. Now, those can be well informed, as Reba suggests. Let's understand all the pieces, but then let's not dodge the fact that we have to step up to the plate and make political, you can call them spiritual if you want, I don't want to downgrade politics, but those are decisions that come from something other than science.
And the public interest in various things in law is always a balancing question. So it's true in that case in St. Clair that you mentioned. Well, there's refinery workers and there's ranchers, and what will the water, how do we weigh those? Or, you know, there's these guys, the lowers, who are taking a risk and they think they, you know, can make this suboptimal land, that's what they say. And then there's people saying, we've got evidence that in 40 years, X will happen if it's max development. Well, but we're not gonna allow max development. So all of that gets weighed in this making a public interest decision, and probably always will be many different things get weighed.
Yeah, so I do agree. I mean, they are political decisions, but with all the law students in the room and a few professors as well, I think another important question though is the process by which those political decisions are made and at what level of government. And right now, the process that's in place doesn't necessarily, what we've heard is there's some ways it's not matching current societal needs. And so that's why the legislature, the governor, maybe, and it involves questions of local authority versus state authority, but those are all appropriate legal questions to work through and I guess it adds this important question of, you know, what is the governance structure? Because if you set the governance structure in terms of where the decision is made and by what criteria, then that is an important piece of how you efficiently and effectively make those political decisions.
Are wildlife needs for water accounted for in Wyoming water law?
Well, no, I would say no, especially in this case, that the wildlife was never considered in this analysis. And I suppose with the in-stream flow, there is that, but there is no in-stream flow protection in this basin.
Yeah.
As we talked about, prior appropriation was put into place, among other things, to get water to use. Water is a non-renewable resource. So what other system of regulating groundwater pumping would work better, and what are similarly situated Western states doing?
Yeah, that's, I mean, there's, like the tributary law in Colorado would be one example of using that. I think maybe I'm not understanding your question about different kinds of engineering solutions for getting groundwater. Is that
Or like a governance system as opposed to prior appropriation, say something like correlative rights or restatement reasonable use.
Okay, so this is more.
What I mean, this is the way I think it should be. The state engineer should eliminate the groundwater and surface water divisions, and they should become one. Because when you pump groundwater, you affect surface water. And that calculation needs to be considered when you are appropriating groundwater. The reason we are in the situation we're in is because in the 1960s and 70s, the federal government highly encouraged farmers to get center pivots. And they sound like a great idea, like, okay, we'll grow more winter feed, like Augustus was saying, to feed your cattle. But it's morphed into this thing that has really affected surface water far beyond anything that they understood would happen at the time that they were encouraging farmers to get these pivots. So now that that's happened, I think we're gonna have to take a look at the impact. And it's kind of happening, but I would encourage the state legislature to appropriate enough money to do another study of this system, because the 2015, the AMEC report is a very good start, but it's not like it's complete, so we need to do more analysis of the impact to this aquifer. Probably is in all aquifers, that's what I think.
And as you know, the legislature in Wyoming is eager to spend more money. Yeah.
So, as discussed in part one, there's kind of, maybe not explicit, but there at least implicit encouragement from the Wyoming state government to overflow. And I was wondering, what is the main driving force? Is it agriculture? Is it mining? Is it fracking? Why are we seeing that being so pushed right now in our government?
I didn't hear what's being pushed.
Overflowing.
Oh, well, because back in the 60s and 70s, they over appropriated the system. It was something that started back then, and that's why they started a control area too. Because in the 80s, people recognized the system was already stressed. And so there was a recognition in the 80s that this has gone too far even then. So, but it needs to probably be going even further and do a greater analysis of impacts now.
Is there a specific industry that this is kind of going towards though? Is it mainly agriculture?
Yeah, so right now in Laramie County, the bulk of water is used for agriculture, but that's changing. I mean, there's so much more demand for groundwater. You've got gas plants now that are, converting that to electricity. It uses 400 acre feet of water a year. You've got data farms, which are outside of the control area that stand to use a ton of water. And that's something that, is not within a control area. So there's a lot of other industries that are driving the demand for groundwater at this point. The center pivot era is kind of playing itself out. But now there's going to be a demand to use this groundwater for other industries, such as technology.
But the existence of the control area, one of the things, hasn't Cheyenne been resisting being part of the control area? Of course. That's one of the interesting dynamics going on, and that the city of Cheyenne, which probably has an interest in having these industries happen, has been very reluctant to become part of the control area, which tries to put limits on travel. But the creation of the control area is not pushing, it's actually trying to restrain. Did you have anybody else?
Yeah, we have a couple more.
Okay. Just about time, and everybody else.
Yes. So let's give these wonderful ladies a round of applause for their. Thank you all so much for coming. If you have any extra questions or anything like that, I'm sure they would love to sit and answer more questions after all with everything.
Can I say one thing? We do have these books.
Yes.
If you're really interested, please take one. They're gifts from Stan Leek and Paul Barlow.
Yes, absolutely.
So I have one thing. I'm Jason, Professor Robinson here for Law School. So many people contributed to the field day and to this panel. Appreciate everybody engaging either in person or online. Nobody put more into it though than our alum, Reva Adler. And I just want to recognize Reva as an accomplished grad at Law School.
Right.